Hi, welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'll try to answer a few questions that came up in my last video. Is there a big improvement when shooting RAW video versus shooting ProRes? Well, let's find out. For the last 5 years, I've been working here in Ireland as a freelance cameraman and editor for a number of video production companies. The main challenge on creating great content with fast turnarounds and doing so within budget, it's adhering to the steps in the process. What are the benefits of shooting RAW versus ProRes, and how different does RAW look compared to 10-bit ProRes coming from the same camera? In this example, I'm going to use the Ursa Mini. This question comes directly from one of the comments in my latest video about the Sigma FP. Some viewers thought that recording internally in the Sigma FP generated footage of significantly less quality than if I had recorded externally in RAW. Today we're going to talk about a few things. Although RAW is a more robust codec, it's not the codec for everybody, and I'm going to show you why. So in today's video we're going to talk about detail, dynamic range, flexibility in post, and file size comparison between ProRes and RAW. I work in the Adobe suite. Although I do have DaVinci Resolve, it's not my main editing platform. So first, let's talk about the fact that Premiere Pro can handle natively Cinema DNG compressed files. This alone might be a step in the process that will lead to more time spent in Premiere and Resolve doing round trips of proxy media, which is a very time-consuming process, and in some productions you won't have that time. People will always want to shoot in RAW because they think they need that extra flexibility that RAW gives you in post. The problem is that most don't have a real need to shoot in RAW, and ProRes will be a great codec for them to shoot on in most cases. Uncompressed RAW files are very large and require more processing power to edit. And in most cases, they will need to be transcoded to a codec that is easier to edit in real time, and this process is time consuming. So shooting in ProRes with a lock curve is a great way to have flexibility in post, save storage space, and be able to edit with less processing power. Also, transcoding time is greatly reduced if proxy media is required. So to answer the comments in my last video that I did not give the Sigma FP a fair chance, because the camera was able to record great RAW footage, but the internal codec was very different and of less quality. I don't think that's 100% true because the footage characteristics comes directly from the camera, and this applies to whatever codec you shoot in that particular camera. The problem is that the Sigma FP only had one internal codec that was usable. I believe that Sigma will implement a log curve internally in the camera, allowing the camera to shoot in log, but that's going to happen in the future. When I had the camera with me, I recorded with the best codec it had at the time internally. So if I shoot the same scene in ProRes 422 and in RAW and show you the footage side by side, you'll be able to tell that these two clips come from the same camera, and they both share the same camera characteristics. And this applies if you're shooting with a C300, a Red, or a Sony camera. I'm sure most of you have heard about how Canon has perfected their skin tone color science, and how Sony cameras tend to shoot with a little bit of a yellow cast. What I'm trying to say here is that although RAW has benefits over ProRes, it might be not apparent to the untrained eye, and unless you need heavy processing of the footage after the fact, like fixing white balance issues, making drastic changes in exposure, or when filming a scene where the high dynamic range is needed and you need to be able to push your shadows and highlights extensively to balance the scene out without clipping them. Like, don't get me wrong, when I first got my Ursa Mini, I wanted to film all my projects in ProRes 444 and 4.6K, but I rapidly realized that I would need a lot of storage space, so it wasn't viable for me to do so. And I had to be able to pass the cost of storage space down to the clients, but in some projects it actually could not be justified. And not only that, but the extra time I required to transcode the footage needed to be accounted for, as most of the projects I'm working on required a very fast turnaround. So efficiency in my workflow was a key factor for me to be able to deliver great content within time and budget. So in today's video, I'm going to show you a side-by-side comparison of footage shot on the Ursa Mini both in ProRes and DNG RAW. This footage was color corrected and not graded manually on DaVinci Resolve 16 without the use of a LUT. I didn't want to use a LUT because LUTs tend to crash the highlights or the shadows, so I wanted to show you the cleanest footage possible. We all know that YouTube has a crazy compression, so I'm going to actually put a link down in the video description where you can download the full resolution 10-bit file of the side-by-side footage for you to be able to compare the footage on your own. would have to say, based on my findings, there's no real benefit on shooting the same subject in ProRes versus shooting in Cinema DNG and compressed RAW. The details are just very, very similar. When it comes to noise, there's some noise in the raw uncompressed that is not noticeable in the ProRes 422 file. But please note, this is only really noticeable when scaling up the footage 400% in a correctly exposed shot. This is a section that I have to give it to RAW, but not 100%. My point is that both files, when correctly exposed, handle dynamic range very well, both Cinema DNG RAW and ProRes, with RAW having an advantage on that highlight recovery option in Resolve. So this option gives you more latitude and the ability to recuperate data that otherwise would be lost if you shot in ProRes. In this example, you can see that both files look almost identical, and there's no advantage on having highlight recovery option turned on because there's no data being clipped in the highlights.
Here you can see a shot that is overexposed by 2 stops. I did so to give proper exposure to the buildings that were in the shadow. With the highlight recovery tool in Resolve, I can see that I can bring back detail that otherwise would be lost in the waveform monitor. You can see it here in the highlights. When I turn them off, you can see it's clipped, it's detail lost. You can't really see it in the image, but you are losing detail in there. If I turn them on, I can see that that detail or information that was otherwise lost comes back to my waveform monitor. It's not noticeable now, but say that I wanted to grade the sky, which I've done already here with another node, I can then bring all that color back into the sky because the detail is not lost here. So now I can show you this same example in the ProRes shot, and we can clearly see that the detail is been lost here. I don't have the option to use the highlight recovery because this shot is ProRes. Even if I play with the gain and bring the gain down, the highlights are clipped. So there's nothing I can do to bring that information back. So I'll show you now. You can even see what I'm talking about of the detail being lost. When you compare both shots, I'm going to turn off the node I applied to correct the sky, and I'm going to show you side by side ProRes and RAW. They look exactly the same until I'll try to fix the sky in the ProRes. Then you can clearly see the information that is missing in the highlights because this shot was overexposed by 2 stops. And ProRes can't handle the dynamic range the scene had. In this next example, it's actually a bit more apparent, and you'll be able to see the difference between RAW and ProRes without me making too much manipulation to the sky. If we zoom in 400%, we can see with highlight recovery on, there's very little detail being lost. But in fact, there's a lot of detail that's being lost, and if you can see here with highlight recovery, and you can check it out in the waveform monitor, you can see that there's data being clipped here and here when it's off, and when it's on, all this information which is blue color that's coming back that otherwise would be lost if the highlight recovery wasn't on. And if we jump on to the ProRes file, we can clearly see that color tint of detail being lost in the sky. And you can see in the waveform monitor that I'm very close to clipping here. I can't really push it to expose higher because there's information that is gone there and I can't bring it back. You can see that's all information that's been clipped. So I'll move that back there. And if we go 400% zoom, you can clearly see that there is way more detail being lost in the ProRes. So that's one of the benefits of shooting RAW over ProRes.
there's one advantage on shooting RAW that might be handy to have, and that's the ability to change white balance, ISO, gamma, color science, because that is all metadata when you're shooting RAW. And it's a non-destructive change, just like you would change a RAW image in Lightroom or Photoshop. In the other hand, there's the possibility that you could change slight color cast in ProRes with color correction. But please note that major changes in color would be a hard fix to do in ProRes, as the white balance is baked into the footage. This is the main issue I think will limit the average Joe from shooting everything in RAW. I personally think it's not efficient shooting everything in RAW, and there's a big difference, as you can see, in the file sizes when shooting in Cinema DNG RAW or ProRes 422 in the same resolution. The RAW file is effectively 3 times bigger than ProRes when shooting in the same resolution. So in RAW, every 10 seconds you're using 2.6 gigabytes. And in ProRes, for the same resolution, you would use 800 megs every 10 seconds. So if someone like Marques Brownlee was struggling with the massive file sizes his Red camera was generating per project and having to delete all the raw footage after the project was edited, what's for the rest of us mortals? Check out this video here where he comments on the topic. If you can afford to spend a few €100 a month in storage space, then that's fine. If you're shooting commercially and you can pass the cost of storage space to clients, in that case it might make sense to shoot everything in RAW. My conclusion is that although RAW is a more robust codec than ProRes, ProRes is still an easier to handle codec that will save me render times and storage space, making my workflow a bit more efficient. All I need to do is understand the limitations of the codec and my camera, and hopefully that will allow me to create better content for YouTube and for my clients. I would love to know what you guys think. Do you shoot in RAW or ProRes? And how do you make the decision on when to use either codec? That's it for now. If you're new here, hit that like button. If you really like the video, subscribe to the channel, and see you next time.